This is Chapter 48 of Pride and Prejudice, or Chapter 6 of Volume 3. The whole party were in hopes of a letter from Mr. Bennet the next morning, but the post came in without bringing a single line from him. His family knew him to be, on all common occasions, a most negligent and dilatory correspondent, but at such a time they had hoped for exertion. They were forced to conclude that he had no pleasing intelligence to send, but even of that they would have been glad to be certain. Mr. Gardiner had waited only for the letters before he set off. So everyone's eagerly awaiting Mr. Bennet's letters, but there's no news, so Mr. Bennet does not write. They're all very anxious about this. When he was gone, they were certain at least of receiving constant information of what was going on, and their uncle promised at parting to prevail on Mr. Bennet to return to Longbourn as soon as he could, to the great consolation of his sister, who considered it as the only security for her husband's not being killed in a duel. So Mr. Gardiner goes after Mr. Bennet. Everyone is thinking that Mr. Gardiner will write and update them at least. And Mrs. Bennet is determined that Mr. Bennet should come back because she's very afraid that Mr. Bennet will duel Wickham and die. Mrs. Gardiner and the children were to remain in Hertfordshire a few days longer, as the former thought her presence might be serviceable to her nieces. She shared in their attendance on Mrs. Bennet and was a great comfort to them in their hours of freedom. Their other aunt also visited them frequently, and always, as she said, with the design of cheering and heartening them up, though she never came without reporting some fresh instance of Wickham's extravagance or irregularity. She seldom went away without leaving them more dispirited than she found them. So Mrs. Gardiner is a good comfort for the children, for Jane and Elizabeth, the Bennet's daughters. Mrs. Phillips, their other aunts, comes over, and she's not very comforting. She wants to cheer them up, but she keeps telling them news of Wickham being a bad guy, which is just making the situation worse. All Meryton seems striving to blacken the man who, but 3 months before, had been almost an angel of light. He was declared to be in debt to every tradesman in the place, and his intrigues, all honored with the title of seduction, had been extended to every tradesman's family. Everybody declared that he was the wickedest young man in the world, and everybody began to find out that they had always distrusted the appearance of his goodness. If you begin to find out that you always haven't trusted someone, there's a problem with that. There's an underlying contradiction. So you can't just find out that you always didn't trust someone. So all people in town now are hearing about Wickham's bad decisions and scandalous behavior and poor choices, and now it's coming out that he's done a lot of bad stuff. Elizabeth, though she did not credit above half of what was said, believed enough to make her former assurance of her sister's ruin still more certain, and even Jane, who believed still less of it, became almost hopeless, more especially as the time was now come, when, if they had gone to Scotland, which she had never before entirely despaired of, they must in all probability have gained some news of them. So Elizabeth doesn't believe all the rumors about Wickham, but she believes enough to think that Lydia is really, her reputation is ruined forever. Jane even realizes that if they had gone to Scotland and gotten married, that they would have at least heard by now that Lydia and Wickham were married. Mr. Gardiner left Longbourn on Sunday. On Tuesday, his wife received a letter from him. It told them that on his arrival, he had immediately found out his brother and persuaded him to come to Gracechurch Street. That Mr. Bennet had been to Epsom and Clapham before his arrival, but without gaining any satisfactory information. That he was now determined to inquire at all the principal hotels in town, as Mr. Bennet thought it possible they might have gone to one of them on their first coming to London before they procured lodgings. Mr. Gardiner himself did not expect any success from this measure, but as his brother was eager in it, he meant to assist him in pursuing it. He added that Mr. Bennet seemed wholly disinclined at present to leave London, and promised to write again very soon. There was also a postscript to this effect. I've written to Colonel Forster to desire him to find out, if possible, from some of the young man's intimates in the regiment, whether Wickham has any relations or connections who will be likely to know in what part of the town he has now concealed himself. If there were anyone that could apply to, with a probability of gaining such a clue as that, it might be of essential consequence. At present we have nothing to guide us. Colonel Forster will, I dare say, do everything in his power to satisfy us on this head. But on second thought, perhaps Lizzie could tell us what relations he has now living better than any other person. So Mr. Bennet did go to 2 other places, had no information about Lydia and Wickham. He plans to go to all the different hotels in London to see if Lydia and Wickham stopped there and if they could track them down that way. Mr. Gardner is going to help him, although he doesn't know if that idea will work. He writes to Colonel Forster to see if any men in the regiment may know where Wickham has gone, and he also asks if maybe Lizzie, who was friendly with Wickham before, has an idea of where he could be. Elizabeth was at no loss to understand from whence this deference for her authority proceeded, so Elizabeth knows that everyone knows she used to like Wickham. But it was not in her power to give any information of so satisfactory a nature as the compliment deserved, so Elizabeth does not know where Wickham could be. She had never heard of his having had any relations except a father and mother, both of whom had been dead many years. It was possible, however, that some of his companions in the shire might be able to give more information, and though she was not very sanguine in expecting it, the application was a something to look forward to. Every day at Longbourn was now a day of anxiety, but the most anxious part of each was when the post was expected. The arrival of letters was the first grand object of every morning's impatience. Through letters, whatever of good or bad was to be told would be communicated, and every succeeding day was expected to bring some news of importance. So letters are really your vital means of long-distance communication in Regency England, and every time the mail comes, the letters are very much eagerly awaited. But before they heard again from Mr. Gardner, a letter arrived for their father, from a different quarter, from Mr. Collins, which, as Jane had received directions to open all that came for him in his absence, she accordingly read, and Elizabeth, who knew what curiosities his letters always were, looked over her and read it likewise. It was as follows: "My dear sir, I feel myself called upon by our relationship and my situation in life to condole with you on the grievous affliction you are now suffering under, of which we were yesterday informed by a letter from Hertfordshire. Be assured, my dear sir, that Mrs. Collins and myself sincerely sympathize with you and all your respectable family in your present distress, which must be of the bitterest kind, because proceeding from a cause which no time can remove. No argument shall be wanting on my part that can alleviate so severe a misfortune, or that may comfort you under a circumstance that must be of all others most afflicting to a parent's mind. The death of your daughter would have been a blessing in comparison of this, and it is the more to be lamented because there is reason to suppose, as my dear Charlotte informs me, that his licentiousness of behaviour in your daughter has proceeded from a faulty degree of indulgence. Though at the same time, for the consolation of yourself and Mrs. Bennet, I am inclined to think that her own disposition must be naturally bad, or she could not be guilty of such an enormity at so early an age. However that may be, you are grievously to be pitied, in which opinion I am not only joined by Mrs. Collins, but likewise by Lady Catherine and her daughter, to whom I have related the affair. They would agree with me in apprehending that this false step in one daughter will be injurious to the fortunes of all the others, for who, as Lady Catherine herself condescendingly says, will connect themselves with such a family? And this consideration leads me, moreover, to reflect with augmented satisfaction on a certain event of last November, for had it been otherwise, I must have been involved in all your sorrow and disgrace. Let me advise you then, my dear sir, to console yourself as much as possible, to throw off your unworthy child from your affection forever, and leave her to reap the fruits of her own heinous offence. I am, dear sir, and company, and company." Oh my God. So Mr. Collins is writing ostensibly to comfort them, but this is really a horrible letter. He's just rubbing salt into the wound. So he says things like, he's sorry, this is like the worst thing that could have ever happened to the family, and also it must feel really bad because it had to mean that the parents had some fault. If this is what's happening to Lydia. And then he also says, but Lydia is probably naturally bad if she is doing this awful, horrible, enormously bad thing. He says it would be better if Lydia were dead than to have this happen. He says that this is going to ruin the lives of all the rest of the Bennet family from this happening. And then he says... then he also says that Lady Catherine de Bourgh knows, so now this is another person who knows about this. And then he says, and this consideration leads me moreover to reflect with augmented satisfaction on a certain event of last November, for had it been otherwise, I must have been involved in all your sorrow and disgrace. So he's suggesting there that if Elizabeth had accepted his proposal and he married Elizabeth, he, Mr. Collins, would be involved in the Bennet scandal. And he's like, yeah, I'm glad I escaped that trap. It's just very, very rude and obnoxious and incredibly pompous and condescending of him to write this really very not consoling, kind of rubbing it in their faces letter. Mr. Gardner did not write again till he had received an answer from Colonel Forster, and then he had nothing of a pleasant nature to send. It was not known that Wickham had a single relation with whom he kept up any connection, and it was certain that he had no near one living. His former acquaintances had been numerous, but since he had been in the militia, it did not appear that he was on terms of particular friendship with any of them. There was no one, therefore, who could be pointed out as likely to give any news of him, and in the wretched state of his own finances there was a very powerful motive for secrecy, in addition to his fear of discovery by Lydia's relations, for it had just transpired that he had left gaming debts behind him to a very considerable amount. Colonel Forster believed that more than £1,000 would be necessary to clear his expenses at Brighton. He owed a good deal in the town, but his debts of honour were still more formidable. Mr. Gardner did not attempt to conceal these particulars from the Longbourn family. Jane heard them with horror. "A gamester!" she cried. "This is wholly unexpected. I had not an idea of it." So Mr. Gardner says Colonel Forster doesn't know anyone who would know where Wickham is. He has no near family, no one who he's really friendly with. His other acquaintances before the militia had all dropped him, and also that Wickham has been gambling pretty extensively, so he left more classic kind of debts, so he would maybe pay for something on credit and say, "Oh yeah, I'll pay you back for those shoes," but then never pay back a shop owner or someone who would have kept him at an inn or served him food, etc. But he also owes a lot of gambling debts in addition to that. Mr. Gardner added in his letter that they might expect to see their father at home on the following day, which was Saturday. Rendered spiritless by the ill success of all their endeavours, he had yielded to his brother-in-law's entreaty that he would return to his family, and leave it to him to do whatever occasion might suggest to be advisable for continuing their pursuit. When Mrs. Bennet was told of this, she did not express so much satisfaction as her children expected, considering what her anxiety for his life had been before. "What, is he coming home, and without poor Lydia?" she cried. "Surely he will not leave London before he has found them. Who is to fight Wickham, and make him marry her if he comes away?" So Mr. Gardner writes that Mr. Bennet's very upset that he hasn't been able to find Wickham and Lydia, and he's returning home. And then instead of Mrs. Bennet saying, "Yay, he won't be killed in a duel," she's angry that he's not coming back with Lydia. And Mrs. Gardner began to wish to be at home. As Mrs. Gardner began to wish to be at home, it was settled that she and her children should go to London at the same time that Mr. Bennet came from it. The coach therefore took them the first stage of their journey and brought its master back to Longbourn. Mrs. Gardner went away in all the perplexity about Elizabeth and her Derbyshire friend that had attended her from that part of the world. His name had never been voluntarily mentioned before them by her niece, and the kind of half expectation which Mrs. Gardner had formed of their being followed by a letter from him had ended in nothing. Elizabeth had received none since her return that could come from Pemberley. So Mrs. Gardner is also still worried about Elizabeth and Darcy, and realizes that Darcy has not contacted Elizabeth, and that that's not looking good. And we know that she's referring to Darcy because Jane Austen writes her Derbyshire friend, and that's Mr. Darcy. The present unhappy state of the family rendered any other excuse for the lowness of her spirits unnecessary. Nothing, therefore, could be thoroughly conjectured from that, though Elizabeth, who was by this time tolerably well acquainted with her own feelings, was perfectly aware that, had she known nothing of Darcy, she could have borne the dread of Lydia's infamy somewhat better. It would have spared her, she thought, one sleepless night out of two. So Elizabeth is also still very much worried and concerned about her relationship or not relationship with Mr. Darcy. When Mr. Bennet arrived, he had all the appearance of his usual philosophic composure. He said as little as he had ever been in the habit of saying, made no mention of the business that had taken him away, and it was some time before his daughters had courage to speak of it. It was not till the afternoon, when he joined them at tea, that Elizabeth ventured to introduce the subject, and then on her briefly expressing her sorrow for what he must have endured, he replied, "Say nothing of that. Who should suffer but myself? It has been my own doing, and I ought to feel it." "You must not be too severe upon yourself," replied Elizabeth. "You may well warn me against such an evil. Human nature is so prone to fall into it. No, Lizzie, let me once in my life feel how much I have been to blame. I am not afraid of being overpowered by the impression. It will pass away soon enough." So we get some serious from Mr. Bennet here, for one of the first times, he genuinely feels bad. He feels responsible for what's happened and that he could have prevented this situation by not indulging Lydia and kind of just letting her do what she wants. And Elizabeth isn't trying to make him feel badly about it, but that's just how Mr. Bennet is thinking at this point. And he says that he wants to feel a little bit of that blame, and then he kind of gets a little bit more Mr. Bennet-ish, more of his usual himself, and he says it'll pass away soon enough. So he'll feel the blame, and then it'll eventually be gone. Do you suppose them to be in London? Yes. Where else can they be so well concealed? And Lydia used to want to go to London, added Kitty. She is happy then, said her father dryly, and her residence there will probably be of some duration. Again, Mr. Bennet's being sarcastic, so Kitty says, oh, she did want to go to London, and Mr. Bennet's like, well, she's gonna stay in London for a while. Then, after a short silence, he continued, Lizzie, I bear you no ill will for being justified in your advice to me last May, which, considering the event, shows some greatness of mind. So he basically tells Elizabeth that she was right. They were interrupted by Miss Bennet, who came to fetch her mother's tea. This is a parade, cried he, which does one good. It gives such an elegance to misfortune. Another day I will do the same. I will sit in my library in my nightcap and powdering gown and give as much trouble as I can, or perhaps I may defer it till Kitty runs away. I am not going to run away, Papa, said Kitty fretfully. If I should ever go to Brighton, I would behave better than Lydia. You go to Brighton? I would not trust you so near it as Eastbourne for £50. No, Kitty, I have at last learnt to be cautious, and you will feel the effects of it. No officer is ever to enter my house again, nor even to pass through the village. Balls will be absolutely prohibited unless you stand up with one of your sisters, and you are never to stir out of doors till you can prove that you have spent 10 minutes of every day in a rational manner. Kitty, who took all these threats in a serious light, began to cry. Well, Bless, said he, do not make yourself unhappy. If you are a good girl for the next 10 years, I will take you to a review at the end of them. So then by the end of this chapter, we see a much more sarcastic, witty, Mr. Bennet-ish Mr. Bennet. So he says, so Jane comes in to bring tea to Mrs. Bennet, and Mr. Bennet goes, oh, what a parade. I guess that makes your unhappiness seem elegant and fancy. And then he jokes that he's going to lock himself in his library and stay in his pajamas. And give everyone a problem and just, kind of like wallow in his sadness as Mrs. Bennet is doing. And then he may do that when Kitty runs away, and then Kitty takes this very seriously. She doesn't get her father's sense of humor, just like her mother doesn't. And she goes, oh my God, no, if I go to Brighton, I would never run away. And then Mr. Bennet says, no, you're not going to Brighton. And by the way, you're not allowed to go to any balls, and you're not allowed to dance with any men, etc., etc. He's just comically overreacting to the situation. But again, Kitty takes it seriously. And is very upset by this, and then Mr. Bennet says, oh, well, if you're good for 10 years, then I'll take you to a review, and maybe, well, I'll let up on some of these restrictions. Kitty has cried about this, so she's convinced that this is serious. We, as readers, should know better, and that Mr. Bennet is, in fact, being sarcastic. A little bit of comic relief in an otherwise very tense situation, and that's chapter 48.